These are Chris Griffin's worst ever moments in Family Guy. We kick things off at number 10 with Stew-Roids, an episode where popularity has Chris treating Meg even worse than usual. Chris's story starts at school when he and Meg come across James Woods High's most popular girl.
There's Connie D'Amico. Chris, don't walk next to me.
Can't ruin that pristine public image of yours, can you, Meg? Meg tries to buddy up to Connie by gifting her a CD of the High School Musical soundtrack, and let's just say Connie lets her down as gently as she can.
You actually like High School Musical? What are you, 8?
Connie's boyfriend Scott finishes off the insult with a fart, and Meg runs off crying. When Scott leaves, Connie talks about dumping him and switching to a new boy toy, though her friend reminds her that she's already dated every popular boy in school. But Connie doesn't just need a new man, she needs a challenge. And while thinking of losers she can make popular, her eyes fall on Chris. Challenge accepted. Chris and Meg sit down for a nice lunch together. But lunch will have to wait because Connie is coming this way. She's not here for Meg though, who she quickly dismisses. She's here for Chris, who she dubs the most unpopular boy in school. He's a bit surprised by this, considering it sounds like there's stiff competition.
What about Smiley McGee over there?
Without even asking, Connie tells Chris that they have a date Saturday night, and Chris, like everyone else in the world, doesn't understand why, but agrees to go through with it. Chris sweetly asks to hold Connie's hand when they go in, which Connie agrees to, thinking it will make him look even cooler. But Chris doesn't care about that, he just wants to do it because he likes her. Based on her reaction, you'd think someone was speaking to her in a different language.
I don't understand.
Of course you don't, Connie. Chris compliments her, saying she's nice and pretty, which throws Connie for a loop. No boy has ever been this nice to her. They decide to ditch the rally for a movie instead. By the way, you read the title correctly. This is a list of Chris's worst moments. We'll get to the bad stuff soon enough. The next day, Connie and Chris finally make their relationship official to all, and as expected, everyone is dumbfounded. Even the jocks acknowledge Chris for the first time.
Hey, Griffin!
Griffin Mano!
Connie's friend is impressed she made Chris popular, now expecting her to dump him. But Connie doesn't want to, explaining how he's different from the other guys. She's even going over to his house so she can meet his parents. If she had any brains at all, she'd stay as far away from that place as possible. But she goes through with it anyway and meets the family. Her first question, understandably, is what's going on with the buff baby across from her. But that, dear viewers, is a topic for a different video. Peter, being the grown toddler that he is, has to make the evening weird.
I like what you're doing with your boobs.
Dad!
And Meg tries to use the situation to finally be friends with Connie. Like that'll ever happen. At school, Chris has gone through quite the transformation. His style is much cooler and everybody's being nice to him. He even has a jock come up to him to say how stoked he is for Chris's party that weekend. I'll spare you the audio so you don't die from cringe. Meg can't wait to party it up with Connie, but she's informed that she isn't invited to a party at her house. Chris confirms this. She's simply just not cool kid material. Meg is left to watch as the dorky brother she once knew walks away a rude, heartless douche. While the party rages on, Meg spends the night crying in her bedroom while Lois tries to comfort her.
Here's a Sylvia Plath book and a bottle of Ambien. I'm gonna look the other way and whatever happens, happens.
Downstairs, Connie loses track of Chris, and unfortunately for her, she finds him making out with 2 girls. She's obviously mad considering it was her that made him popular, but now Chris has grown past the need for Connie. Why have 1 girl when you can have 2 girls? Just don't involve a cup.
Come on, girls, let's go upstairs and make out.
The next day, the jocks praise Chris for ditching Connie. Totally righteous move. Kids still say that, right? I'm not that old, guys, okay? Connie tries to take a seat, but it's clear she's no longer a part of the popular crowd. Rejected, Connie hopes to find help from Meg. Meg's response is less than accepting.
You want my help? You can go yourself.
But after taking a javelin to the shoulder from Chris, she changes her mind and agrees to take him down. I would too. Where did he even get a javelin? Meg and Connie hatch a plan to stick it to Chris, which involves broadcasting a video of Chris doing his best Buffalo Bill impression from Silence of the Lambs in front of the entire school.
Would you do me? I'd do me.
It's disturbing, but you've got to appreciate the authenticity, tucking it in and all. Now that everyone has seen his little performance, Chris is officially rejected from the high social circle. Thus, by the ancient rules of high school, Connie is popular once again. Look, I don't make the rules, I just follow them. Connie thanks Meg for the help, and then it's right back to the status quo with hating Meg again. Ah, the natural order. But this isn't the only time Chris lets popularity get to his head, as at number 9, becoming homecoming king spells trouble for others in Run, Chris, Run. During a particularly lonely lunch with Neil, Chris hears that the nominations for homecoming king and queen are due in the afternoon. Chris believes more people would hang out with them if one of them won, so Neil agrees to nominate Chris. It ain't much, but it's honest work. Chris returns home to announce to the family that he's running, much to their shock. Eager to win the hearts of his peers, Chris starts to brainstorm his speech.
Luckily, Chris Griffin rhymes with homecoming king, so I've got my opening line.
His heart is certainly in the right place, even if his brain isn't. Brian is happy for him, but Lois is worried he'll be heartbroken when he eventually loses. The next day at school, the potential kings give their speeches in front of the student body, including Chris. He decides to not open with that rhyme that doesn't rhyme and instead goes for a Webster's Dictionary definition. Honestly, I think I liked the first idea better. With all the votes cast, Lois prepares to comfort Chris for the inevitable. Except...
And this year's James Woods High homecoming king is Chris Griffin.
Yay!
He did it, guys! He actually did it! In honor of his victory, Chris celebrates the next morning with the Breakfast of Kings, pork chops and French onion soup. Meg, on the other hand, isn't as happy. She believes Chris was elected so he could get pranked at the dance. This worries Stewie and Brian, who decide to go to the school in the hopes of talking the culprits out of it. While totally undercover as high schoolers, Brian and Stewie set out to find the popular kids. They decide to ask a few girls about the prank, but of course, Brian has to get ahead of himself.
You know what'd be crazy? If me, a guy, went in the girls' room with you two.
Smooth, Brian. Real smooth. After finding out absolutely nothing, Brian and Stewie see the news covering Chris winning the nomination. It then becomes clear the act was done earnestly because his classmates believe him to be... what's the nicest way to put this? Special? Realizing his win is completely out of pity, Brian and Stewie agree to not tell Chris so they don't spoil his big day. As you'd expect, the role has already gone to Chris's head, trumpeting around declaring his intention to take things from Stewie's room that he wants.
There's a book in there on how to eat healthy. Why don't you take that, you fat bitch?
Things only continue to escalate as Chris finds it necessary to go number 2 in his chamber pot, aka a waffle iron. I don't envy the person who has to clean that. Brian tries to talk him down, but Chris now believes he's better than everyone else, even insulting Brian by saying that he's just jealous. This causes Brian to spill the truth, but Chris isn't having any of it. He fully believes that homecoming is going to be the greatest night of his life. On the night of the dance, Chris addresses his loyal subjects who clap and cheer for him a bit too enthusiastically. It's not until the reveal of the homecoming queen, a girl who died in a car crash, that Chris realizes this was all a ruse for their own personal gain.
You just voted for me to make yourselves feel better.
And thus, Chris's reign as king comes to an end. His royal rudeness could be forgiven, but kicking over a dead girl's memorial? That deserves some boos. I never said I was a comedian, guys. At number 8 is the episode Trading Places, where the stress of full-time work drives Chris to a heart attack. Chris and Meg decide to take a peek at Peter's latest 24-hour obsession, a dirt bike. Chris wants to take it out for a joyride, but Meg tries to talk him out of it. After enough pressure, Meg finally agrees to hop on. Feeling the need for speed, Chris wants to try something dangerous.
Hey, Meg, check it out. I'm gonna jump that fire hydrant.
Chris, being the stellar athlete that he is, fails and completely wastes Peter's dirt bike. The two teens are chewed out by their parents at home, and Meg confesses that it was all Chris's idea. So Peter decides to enact his own misguided punishment.
So, you like taking dirt bikes that don't belong to you, huh? Then here, have a whole carton of cigarettes.
He's dumb, but his heart is in the right place, I guess. Lois thinks the kids need a more accurate punishment, but Meg isn't sure what the big deal is, saying that they could always buy another bike. So the mom calls her kids out on their privilege and explains that they have no idea how hard it is to be a parent. Chris pushes back, saying Peter and Lois have it easy because they make all the rules, so Lois proposes an experiment. Parents and kids trade places for a week to see who actually has it the hardest. Oh, that's why it's called Trading Places. The gang tries this out the next day with Meg making breakfast and Chris going to work at the brewery. Everyone seems to be on the same page about their roles. Well, almost everyone.
Peter, no, you're just a normal high school kid.
Oh.
Over at the brewery, Chris is doing a good job of impressing Peter's boss, Angela. Chris explains it's a lot easier than high school, where you have to worry way more about popularity and societal pressures. Meanwhile, at school, Lois and Peter are enjoying the laid-back life of teens while at a pep rally, only Peter seems to be enjoying it a bit too much.
Show me your school spirit!
When it comes time for dinner, Peter and Lois joke that Meg won't be able to handle the task. To their surprise, Meg prepares a full meal including dessert, explaining that she had all day to set this up and questions why Lois takes so long to clean the house when it only took her an hour. To rub even more salt in the wound that is their parents' pride, Chris returns home and reveals that he's in line for a raise at work. For those keeping score, that's 2 points for the kids, 0 points for the adults. Back at school, things aren't going so great for the adults as Lois overhears mean things said about her by the popular girls while Peter suffers at the hands of a new form of spitball. When Chris returns from work that night, Peter and Lois say they want to call off the experiment, admitting that high school is way harder than being an adult. Unfortunately, that's going to be a problem.
That's not gonna work out, Dad.
Why not?
Because you don't have a job anymore.
It turns out that Chris has done such a good job at the brewery that Angela's fired Peter and has hired Chris in his place, making him the breadwinner of the house. Lois forbids Chris from staying at the job, but Chris argues there's no point in high school when he already has a career. With Peter now fresh out of a job, the family has no choice but to let Chris continue working to pay the bills. But the heavy workload begins to stress Chris out, and it's obvious.
You know what would be great? If I could come home and have 5 minutes before you jump all over my back!
Lois and Peter worry that all this stress is too much for Chris, but a drunk Chris barges in and tears into them as his mood continuously shifts from angry to depressed. At dinner the next night, Chris goes on a tirade again about all the finances piling up. Meg suggests they could borrow money from Quagmire, which does not sit well with Chris.
Oh, you'd like that, wouldn't you? Like to see me walk next door, hat in hand, and ask him for money.
While Chris takes Meg to talk to their neighbors, he has a heart attack and collapses on the front lawn. Chris makes a full recovery, but admits that adult life is a lot harder than he once thought. With everything back to normal, Peter leaves us with some parting wisdom.
I guess what we all learned is that no matter who you are or where you come from, life is a terrible thing.
Never mind, that's a lot darker than I thought it would be. Chris continues to disrespect his family at number 7 when he takes Stewie hostage in Secondhand Spoke. After Chris is dropped off at school by Stewie and Brian, he gets targeted by 4 bullies who insult his weight and his sister. Chris's comeback is... look, he tries, bless him.
Oh yeah? Well, you have a sister as well.
Embarrassed, Chris runs into school while Stewie takes pity on his dense brother. Back at home, Stewie interrupts Chris feeding his dead gerbil in a fish tank. So many things wrong with that sentence. Stewie tells Chris he needs to stand up for himself better, but it's clear Chris isn't the best at coming up with insults.
What would you say if I said, "Hey there, shorty"?
I'd say have another donut, you albino gorilla.
Stewie clearly possesses the talking skills that Chris does not, but Stewie assures him that he can be taught how to use his words to earn some respect. The next day at school, Stewie joins Chris to see how he does after their training. When the bullies begin to approach, Chris flubs his insult from being too nervous. Taking matters into his own hands, Stewie climbs into Chris's backpack so he can whisper comebacks into his ear.
I heard you were born out of your mom's butt. I heard that from your mom while I was doing her.
He's gotta work on the delivery, but the insult is strong enough that it makes everyone around laugh. With Stewie as his insult Yoda, Chris seems ready to take on the world. Chris's verbal justice continues when he sees Neil being picked on by the same bullies. Not willing to stand by, Chris lets him have it.
You frequently opt out of swim class because of your gross microcephalic penis!
The defeated bullies run off and Chris is thanked by a cute girl, but unfortunately his finger is still on the trigger.
Back away, foul wench! Your wide hips hold no temptation for me!
Luckily, he's able to turn it around into a compliment and scores the girl's number. During a school assembly, the principal asks if anyone wants to run for student body president. The girl from earlier nominates Chris, and the crowd cheers in agreement. Things are looking up, for now. While preparing for the next day of school, Chris asks Stewie if he's ready for another day of feeding him words. However, Stewie says he has taught everything he knows, leaving Chris ready to strike out on his own. This terrifies Chris, who sees his chances of becoming student president in jeopardy. Desperate, Chris kidnaps Stewie, locking him in his backpack. Stewie is kept locked up for 5 days, unable to escape or properly use the bathroom. I just know it smells crazy in there. When Chris drops his pack to use the bathroom himself, Stewie attempts an escape. But with no way to see, Stewie crashes and burns.
You're gonna die in there.
Why'd you gotta make it dark, man? The time finally comes for the class president election. Stewie refuses to speak for Chris, but he threatens to keep Stewie locked in there forever. Seeing the monster his brother has become, Stewie reminds him that he did this to help him, and in return, he was treated like a servant. Chris has become the very thing he hated. A bully. Racked with guilt, Chris releases Stewie from his backpack prison and drops out of the presidential race. Despite everything, things seem to end on a high note. Thanks to Stewie, Chris is no longer being bullied by those 4. Don't you love a happy ending?
2 of them shot themselves.
Oh, that's so good to hear, Chris.
And the happy ending is postponed. At number 6, Chris's pimple is the one calling the shots in Brian the Bachelor. Chris enters the kitchen to greet his family, but the first thing they notice is the massive pimple on his cheek.
Oh my god, look at the size of that pimple. You're like a circus freak.
Despite the insensitivity, Lois assures him that this is just part of becoming a man. She then says they'll have to do something to get rid of it, but Chris is already pretty attached to his pimple, even going so far as to name him Doug. It looks like Doug is here to stay.
I just wish I didn't have to look at it.
Well, we have to look at your anus all day.
Thank you.
Later that night, Chris compliments his pimple when suddenly Doug starts talking.
Feed me!
That's right, Doug the Pimple is alive, talking, and looking to raise some hell. That can't be good for everyone. Well, maybe not everyone. Lois expresses concern over Chris's new friend, saying he just stays in his room and talks to his pimple, but Peter doesn't think there's anything to worry about.
What's his zit gonna do? Talk to him and tell him to sneak out of the house and cause trouble?
Actually, Peter, that's exactly what's happening. With Doug as the devil on his shoulder, Chris lights a bag on fire on Joe's porch and runs away. But it's not just any bag.
Is that duty?
I'm doing the dishes, Joe. I'll change you in a minute.
Chris's criminal escapades continue when he decides to vandalize a shop wall with a timely message. What did Mayor ever do to him? Chris and Doug are thick as thieves, and it sounds like the fun is only starting. Lois decides to check on Chris, and when he doesn't answer, she goes in and finds the window wide open. Luckily, Chris returns home safe and sound, but Lois is still furious. Chris explains that Doug says he doesn't have to listen to her anymore, which prompts Lois to tell them they're going to the pharmacy to get rid of the zit. Doug will not let that happen. The next morning, Lois and Peter find the pharmacy ransacked. Thinking they're more robbers, Mort throws coffee in Peter's face in self-defense. He apologizes, revealing that someone broke in and destroyed all of his acne medication. Place your bets in the comments below who you think that might be. Lois knows who, but Peter doesn't believe it. Can't worry about that right now, as Brian is bringing home a date from the Bachelorette to meet the family. Is this stupid? Of course, but maybe the family will act normal for a change.
No, Doug, I will not lift up her shirt.
Like clockwork. But Chris does it anyway, much to the family's horror. Dinner is put on hold when Joe pushes the door open with proof it was Chris who broke into the pharmacy. Everything descends into madness as the family chases Chris around the table. Just another night at the Griffins. Later in his room, Chris expresses regret over making his mother cry, declaring that he won't listen to Doug anymore. That doesn't sit well with the Zit, who has now taken over Chris's motor functions, making him punch himself in the face. A terrified Chris changes his mind, understandably.
Now grab my bacon grease and slather me up some homies!
Chris does as he's told and ends up with a pimple party on his face. Luckily, Chris tricks Doug into going to a dermatologist by lying and saying it's the bacon factory. Chris begs the doctor to take Doug off his face, but before he can inject the medicine, Doug pulls out a gun. Don't think too hard, just roll with it. Doug threatens to shoot Chris, but Chris disarms the Zit and dives through the medicine. Doug manages to crawl closer and closer to the gun, though Chris manages to jab him before it's too late, ending Doug's reign of terror. Even though Chris wasn't totally in control, he still gave in to peer pressure. So the lesson of the story is, wash your face. Chris has issues with a different part of his body in An App a Day at number 5. Our journey to that first starts with Peter, who's introduced to the wonderful world of phone apps when Cleveland used Shazam to identify the name of a song.
What's an app?
They're little programs you use on your phone while driving.
Ignore what Cleveland said. Peter gets a little too obsessed with apps, to the point where he ruins his phone by taking it into the shower. Seems like the perfect gift to give Chris, who is very excited about getting his first phone, even if it's busted. The next day at school, Mort and Chris thirst over Marcy Miller. Chris wishes he had the guts to talk to her, but Mort informs him that no one actually talks anymore. They do something else.
If you want to get a girl's attention, you text her a picture of your penis. What? Really?
Sounds odd, but Mort does look like he knows a thing or two about girls. And it just so happens Chris has a new phone. He takes the pic right there. So unsanitary.
All right, what could go wrong? It worked out great for...
Things might not have gone smoothly since Chris, Peter, and Lois are called to the principal's office while Joe is present. The girl did not like the picture Chris sent her unsolicited. Who would have thought? A simple apology isn't going to fix this, considering Chris is technically a minor, meaning he just distributed an illegal picture. Thus, Joe has no choice but to label Chris something worse than a loser or a dork.
I'm sorry, but this makes Chris a sex offender.
There's no hope of keeping this matter quiet, as Chris's name, face, and crime are broadcasted for all to see on the news. Chris just wants to apologize and move on, but the law states he must first take a rehabilitation course. The course is run by possibly the best and worst option, Quagmire. Chris does not want to be here surrounded by creeps, but this is his only option. Or is it?
Well, the law does give you a choice. This or chemical castration.
For those who don't know, that means taking a ton of pills that completely destroy your libido. Isn't science just neat? The family plans to celebrate Chris's graduation from the course, but Chris doesn't want to make a huge deal out of it. Despite clearing his record, Chris is still shunned by his classmates, leaving him a perverted social outcast. Chris goes to Quagmire to ask how he can get everyone to like him again, but Glenn explains that it isn't that simple and he's going to have to learn to live with his new identity. Despite this, Chris gives himself a crazy idea. Chris returns home with new clothes, a haircut, an oddly soothing voice, and a body pumped full of chemicals.
Mother, father, I decided to have myself chemically castrated.
He did this so no one will ever think of him as a creep again. Is this much better though? The family isn't too stoked about Chris's new identity, doubtful that this will help him rather than hurt him. Lois tries to convince him to go off the pills, but Chris refuses.
We rolled 3 gutter balls on these kids, huh?
Peter tries to reignite Chris's desires by exposing him to a post-adult meetup brunch, and I'm only saying adult meetup so YouTube doesn't flag me. You get the gist, right? This scene upsets Chris, and to be fair, I think this would upset most people, castrated or not. Now that Chris's mind is permanently out of the gutter, his focus at school has improved drastically. He announces he's received a Kaplan Prize in biology, the highest score on his Spanish test, and has joined the debate team. Lois starts to think this may have been a good decision all along.
Not thinking about sex all the time seems to have allowed Chris to excel in other areas.
Chris's life has turned around so much that he's even tutoring other students. Doth my eyes deceive me? People used to say that, read a book. Impressed with the new Chris, Marcy apologizes for getting him in trouble. She places a friendly hand on his shoulder, which fires up the engine and reignites the fire deep within. Literally and metaphorically. Unable to control his body, Chris runs off. Please don't make me say what he's going to do. Chris started this episode doing something terrible to someone else, only to end up doing something terrible to himself as a result. That's a double whammy, baby. Things take a violent turn at number 4 as Chris purposefully hurts his girlfriend and Brian in Long John Peter. When the family takes Brian for a visit to the vet, Chris gets the hots for an intern named Anna. Chris's tunnel vision for the blonde causes his heart to sing and also his mouth.
I'm crazy for you. Ba, 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 ba.
Chris is desperate to return to the vets to see Anna again, which Lois says will probably happen if Brian gets sick again. Luckily, Chris knows how to make that happen.
Hey, Brian, look!
Brian should consider himself lucky. That move has killed a man before. The family ends up back at the vets, this time for Peter's parrot, which is a whole other story we don't have time to get into. Chris and Anna strike up their first conversation, and Anna is somehow not weirded out by him.
Sometimes I have to poop for a long time.
He even manages to get her number and a date. I owe Chris an apology. I was not familiar with his game. Chris and Anna seem to be enjoying a nice romantic Italian dinner, but leave it to Chris to blow it in record time.
Did you ever make it with one of the dogs?
What?
I mean, did you enjoy your appetizer?
It hasn't come yet.
Instead of getting up and leaving like a sane person, Anna just tells Chris to relax. Chris worries that showing Anna his inner self will scare her away, as it should, but Anna admits she likes him and plants a big fat kiss. Anna comes to hang out at Chris's place, but when she gets up to leave, she accidentally spills her drink. Chris offers to clean it up as Anna leaves, beaming about their date tomorrow. Peter comes and asks Chris why he's cleaning up her messes, followed by some truly Father of the Year advice.
If you want to get anywhere with a chick, you can't treat him too nice-like.
Peter insists that Chris should treat her like crap the next time they're together. Trusting his dad, he does exactly that.
Can I have 2 tickets, 1 man, and 1 that needs to do what I say?
Finally, Anna's sanity kicks in as she tells Chris he's not the guy she thought he was and to stay away. That's a world-class fumble if I've ever seen one. Chris is heartbroken after getting dumped, but Peter tries to cheer him up by suggesting they go out to meet other girls. And by girls, he means a sock puppet who suspiciously sounds like Peter. This isn't going to help Chris, but Peter at least hopes to get some information out of him.
What are you getting your dad for his birthday?
I don't know, a tie.
Oh, I don't know if he would want one of those.
Peter tries setting Chris up with one of his old crushes, but his awkward singing causes her to walk out. He even sets up a blind date, but she doesn't seem into it when she sees Chris.
Whoa.
Still hung up on Anna, Chris is told by Lois that he should find an excuse to see her again. Cue the only animal in the house.
Is there any more coffee?
Chris gets an excuse to see Anna again and apologizes for being a jerk. He asks for one more chance before planting a kiss on her. The two reconcile and agree to one more date.
Okay, somebody really needs to help me here.
Shut up, Brian, you're spoiling the moment. At number 3, Chris is pressured by popularity once again into kidnapping Meg in Better Off Meg. Meg arrives at school only to find it empty. Well, except for the principal riding around on a tricycle. Don't act like you wouldn't do the same. She's informed it's skip day, which no one bothered to tell her. Getting home, she attempts to call her family to see where they are, and turns out they're having a fun day at the fair with what they think is Meg, but is really just a barrel dressed like her. Easy mistake to make.
If this is you, what's your birthday?
March 23rd.
I have no idea if that's correct. Good day, Seth.
Rejected by her family, Meg decides to spend the day at the bowling alley, getting strikes and watching offensive bowling alley animations. Look, it was a different time, okay? Later that evening, the news reports on a teenage girl who was killed in a car crash with her identity being withheld while the family is notified. A well-timed knock on the Griffin's door can probably tell you who they're talking about.
Peter, Lois, it pains me above the waist to tell you that Meg is dead.
It's only at this point that the Griffins realize they've been hanging out with a barrel all day. Joe explains she was in a car wreck and was burned beyond recognition, identified only by her driver's license. Except, Meg isn't actually dead. She's still at the bowling alley, and it turns out the attendant gave a different girl her ID on accident.
Sorry, them shoe spray fumes made me all goofy in my head.
The thing that really shocks Meg is that no one seems to care. Has she ever seen the show? Meg's funeral is held not long after, and it's a pretty sad scene. Well, sadder than usual for a funeral. Barely anyone shows up, no one says any kind words, and they're still using the barrel for her picture. Chris starts getting approached by several girls who attempt to comfort him and give him more attention than he's used to. As he should be, Chris is mortified realizing what's going on.
Wow, are girls coming on to me because my sister died? Cool!
Just kidding, he lives for it. It turns out that Meg is there watching, and when she sees how few people turn up, she decides to move to a new city and start a new life. Back at home, the Griffins struggle to get through dinner. Though everyone is emotional, it seems like no one has anything positive to say about Meg.
Meg, wherever you are, I hope that you're with Bubba. And I want you to know that Lieutenant Dan is walking around.
Is this from Forrest Gump?
Elsewhere, Meg is doing pretty well for herself. She moves to a new city, lives in an apartment, she can fix up and decorate, and even becomes friends with her new neighbors. Man, maybe I should fake my death sometime. Chris seems to be doing okay for himself too, as he's given a ton of attention from others at school. Girls are asking him to be in their selfies, guys are giving him high-five hugs, and he even gets the keys to the driver's ed car. Who knew having a dead family member could be so much fun? Chris is living the high life, proudly letting his dead sister become his entire identity. That is, until he gets a shocking phone call.
Hello?
Hey, Chris.
Meg, are you alive?
What do you think, Chris? Meg agrees to tell him everything, but asks for him to meet up with her. Despite her amazing new life, Meg finds herself missing the whole family. Chris warns that things are different now, and before Meg can find out anything more, Chris shoves her into the back of a moving van. Not ready to give up his popularity just yet, Chris needs to keep Meg out of the picture, which means leaving her tied up in an abandoned warehouse. While she struggles to get out, the school holds a ceremony for Meg, aka What's Her Name, with the Griffin family also in attendance. Unwilling to take this lying down? Well, okay, she is taking it lying down, actually. As she withers away, Meg's life starts to flash before her eyes.
Ah! Oh yeah! Over! I'm a tomato.
I'm not in any of these.
What does that say about Meg when even she can't remember herself? This fires Meg up, who decides to savagely smash her face against the ground to create enough blood to slide out on. Respect. Meg bursts into the auditorium alive and not exactly well. The family is relieved to see Meg, and when Lois asks what happened, Meg singles out the culprit.
He did this.
Initially, this is interpreted as Chris saving her life, which draws cheers and confetti. But Chris quickly clears things up and apologizes to Meg. Moved by his half-hearted apology, Chris is carried out like he's the star quarterback. So he kidnapped his sister for clout and didn't learn his lesson. Solid. At number 2, Chris gets in trouble with private pictures yet again in Teacher's Heavy Pet. Chris is once again involved in homecoming, but instead of being king, he's elected as the dunce for the 4th year in a row.
This is Chris Griffin's 4th win for Adam West High homecoming dunce, even though he's only a sophomore.
As to be expected, Chris is pretty depressed after the game, continuing to be bullied for his 4-year streak. Lois comes home and announces that she managed to land a substitute teaching job at Chris's school, which doesn't exactly help his mood. Sure, she lied about having a master's degree, but we just call that girl bossing, I think.
you saw how unpopular I am at school, having my mother as a teacher will make things worse.
Firstly, God bless Seth Green and his vocal cords after doing Chris's voice for 25 years. Secondly, Lois has already thought of that, applying under her maiden name and planning to wear a disguise. But Chris isn't convinced and storms off. The next day, Lois Pewterschmidt officially arrives at Adam West High. And wouldn't you know, she just so happens to be teaching Chris's class. Many of the male students start ogling over the new teacher, much to Chris's disgust. As the day goes on, Chris gets increasingly worried that someone will put two and two together. But when the cool kids table invites him over, he's asked if he thinks Mrs. Pewterschmidt is hot. Chris kind of agrees, but it's clear the probing questions make him uncomfortable.
Yeah, I guess she's a total hottie.
When two guys see Chris getting in the car with Mrs. P, their fantasies run wild.
Hey, Chris, get down.
Whoa, Griffin's a selfless lover.
Chris is questioned by the popular kids the next day, asking if he managed to score. Knowing his stock will rise if he plays along, he details a story just vague enough to sound believable, but just innocent enough to not make me throw up in my mouth. So impressed by Chris's game, the popular kids carry him out like a king. All hail dating your mom, I guess? Rumors start to make their way back home as Meg questions Chris. He admits to playing along to score some brownie points, while Meg reminds Chris that Lois could be arrested if anyone finds out. Refusing to go back to being an outcast, Chris continues to play the part. Back at school, Chris's same old story is growing tired and the others are starting to get suspicious.
That's not sex. Tell us exactly what you and she did.
Chris can't come up with a good story with the popular kids smelling his BS from a mile away. They demand a naked picture of Mrs. Pewterschmidt and exile him from their table until he can supply the goods. Despite a ton of hesitance, Chris sneaks into the bathroom to take a picture of his mom in the shower. Ugh, even just saying that sentence made me want to hurl. Chris can't bring himself to do it, but Quagmire, cosplaying as the bathroom wall, encourages him to embrace his dark side. He's like a Darth Vader that isn't allowed within 50 feet of a school.
That it has even gone this far means you are a dirtbag. Own it.
After those wise words of wisdom, Chris manages to go through with it for the good of his popularity. The popular kids demand to see the picture the next day, which Chris obliges. They ask to have the pic sent to them, but Chris makes them promise not to share it. They do, and within seconds, it's clear they're full of crap. Every person in the school gets a hold of that picture, including the principal. Definitely a wrong example of sharing is caring. Lois is called into the principal's office, thinking she's been busted for the master's degree. Surely this won't lead to any wacky misunderstandings.
I mean, I did the same thing at my son's preschool and no one cared.
When the principal shows her the revealing photo, she storms home to give Chris an ultimatum. Tell the truth or she will. All Chris wanted was a little taste of the popular life, and in a weird way, Lois kinda gets it. Chris comes clean to his peers, but when she sees his reputation vanish before her eyes, Lois valiantly backtracks and corroborates Chris's story. The story ends with Chris once again becoming popular and Lois serving 6 years in prison for having a relationship with a minor. A fairy tale ending if I've ever seen one. Finally, at number 1, Chris continues to bring the hurt, only this time it nearly kills Stewie in Brian Griffin's House of Payne. Chris sneaks into Meg's room and reads the saddest book known to man.
Dear Diary, still no sign of that tampon from last week, but the headaches are getting worse.
Meg catches him in the act and tries to get it back from him, but Chris is too quick, which I'm sure is something he's never been referred to as. Their scuffing spills into the hallway where an oblivious Stewie becomes their victim.
Well, I'm off to buy imaginary groceries.
The two older siblings check to see if he's okay and see that he's still breathing, but that gash on his head and the vomiting? I'm no doctor, but I think that might be a problem. Chris and Meg take Stewie to his bed, worrying about him being unconscious. Lois comes in to bring Stewie to dinner, but Chris offers to do it for her. They make it downstairs with Stewie wearing a cowboy hat to cover his injury. At least Lois thinks it's cute. When the baby falls face first into his food, Chris does a little ventriloquism to sell the act.
Oi, blimey, it's alright. This is how I do declare waka waka.
I have no notes for this English accent. The next day, Chris tries to clean Stewie's wound while Meg suggests they take him to a hospital. Peter comes to check in on them before dropping a bombshell of a question.
So, question, how long has Stewie been unconscious?
The jig is up as Meg apologizes and tries to put all the blame on Chris. Yet Peter doesn't seem bothered at all, admitting to having knocked out all of his children at one point or another. He agrees to help them instead of taking Stewie to a hospital. Honestly, would you expect anything less at this point? During the premiere of Brian's new television show, Peter brings Stewie down with drawn-on eyes, a top hat, and a stick to make his arm move. And everyone buys it because I guess everyone is an idiot in this town. After what seems like days since Stewie fell unconscious, the trio takes a look at what they're dealing with. I don't think his head should look like a week-old meatloaf. Meg begs them to finally take him to the hospital, but Peter still has one last trick up his sleeve. Lois's first instinct is to try to cover this up, which both shocks and weirdly fills Peter with admiration. Thankfully, they agree to go to the hospital. So this was really a Chris, Meg, and Peter worst moment. Consider yourself lucky, that's a 3-for-1 deal. At least everything worked out in the end.
Hey, I just found out it's November. What the happened?
To avoid being like Stewie and missing everything, be sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we post a video. There's even a new video you can watch right now by clicking right here on the screen. See you next time!